What if I told you that in northern New Mexico during the 1870s, two cattle empires fought a war so bloody that even hardened frontiersmen were shocked by the body count? That homesteaders were gunned down in their fields, that ambushes happened in broad daylight on main streets, and that one of the deadliest gunfighters in the West rode through it all, leaving bodies in his wake. This wasn't the Lincoln County War that made Billy the Kid famous. This was something darker, more brutal, and for decades it's been overshadowed by flashier Old West stories. But the Colfax County War deserves to be remembered, because it shows what happened when land, money, and power collided on the frontier, and when men decided the fastest way to settle a dispute was with a bullet. The trouble started with something that should have been simple: land grants. In northern New Mexico territory, the Maxwell Land Grant covered nearly 2 million acres. That's larger than the state of Delaware. Spanish and Mexican governments had awarded the land decades earlier, but by the 1870s, ownership had changed hands. A group of investors now controlled it, and they wanted every acre back. Every single one. Even the parts where settlers had been living for years. Those settlers? They'd built homes, planted crops, raised families, filed claims under the Homestead Act that promised them the land if they improved it. The law was on their side, or so they thought. The Maxwell Land Grant Company disagreed. They had older papers, Spanish land grants that predated American law, and they had lawyers, lots of lawyers. And when the lawyers didn't work fast enough, they had guns. The company hired range detectives. That's what they called them. Range detectives. Sounds official, sounds legal. In reality, these were hired gunmen whose job was simple: convince settlers to leave. Convince them with threats, with burned barns, with dead cattle. And if that didn't work, with bullets. The settlers fought back. They formed their own groups, armed themselves, refused to abandon land they'd worked for years. And suddenly, Colfax County became a war zone where nobody was safe, and the law couldn't or wouldn't stop the killing. One name appears again and again in the violence: Clay Allison. If you know Old West history, that name should make you pause. Clay Allison was a Texas gunfighter with a reputation that preceded him like thunder before a storm. He'd killed men in Kansas, in Texas, in Colorado. Some say he killed 15 men, some say more. What's certain is this: when Clay Allison arrived in Colfax County in the mid-1870s, he came looking for trouble, and he found it. Allison sided with the settlers. Maybe because he hated corporate power. Maybe because he saw opportunity in chaos. Maybe because he just enjoyed the fight. Whatever his reasons, Clay Allison became the settlers' most dangerous weapon. He didn't just shoot men, he terrorized them. He walked into saloons where company men drank and made it clear what would happen if they stayed. He tracked company gunmen into the hills and settled accounts with lead. He made examples. In October 1875, Allison rode into Cimarron, the county seat. The town was company territory. Their men controlled the streets, controlled the businesses, controlled the law. Allison didn't care. He wanted revenge for settlers who'd been killed, wanted blood for blood, and he got it. The details vary depending on who told the story afterward. What's confirmed is this: Allison confronted a man named Chunk Colbert in the St. James Hotel. Colbert was a known killer. Had murdered several men himself. The two sat down for dinner together, ate, talked. Then Allison shot Colbert dead across the table. Some say it was a fair fight, some say it was murder. Allison claimed self-defense, said Colbert had been reaching for his gun. Nobody present contradicted him, nobody dared. But Colbert's death didn't end the violence, it escalated it. Company men retaliated. Settlers struck back. Ambushes became common. Men were found shot on remote trails. Bodies turned up in arroyos. The killing spread beyond Colfax County into neighboring areas, Taos County, Mora County. The violence metastasized like a cancer with no cure. The most notorious incident happened in 1876 at a place called the Pono River. A group of settlers had gathered there, camped near the water while working their claims. Company gunmen surrounded them at dawn. What followed wasn't a gunfight, it was a massacre. The shooters opened fire from cover, cut down unarmed men before they could reach their weapons. Survivors scattered into the brush. Some made it, most didn't. When it was over, 6 settlers lay dead. Their families found them days later. Nobody was ever arrested. Nobody was ever tried. The territorial government in Santa Fe knew what was happening. Couldn't pretend otherwise. Bodies were stacking up. Newspapers as far away as Denver were reporting the violence. But the territorial officials faced a problem. The Maxwell Land Grant Company had money, had lawyers, had political connections reaching all the way to Washington. The settlers had nothing but stubbornness and rifles. When government had to choose between powerful investors and poor homesteaders, the choice was predictable. Governor Samuel Axtell sent militia to restore order. Except the militia took the company's side, arrested settlers for trespassing on land they'd lived on for years, protected company men who'd committed murder, made it clear the government wasn't neutral. It had picked a winner. And the settlers weren't it. Some settlers gave up, packed what they could carry and left, walked away from homes they'd built with their own hands, abandoned fields they'd cleared and planted. They had no choice. You can't fight lawyers, politicians, and hired guns simultaneously. Not when you're a farmer with a family to protect. Not when the government itself has become your enemy. But others stayed, dug in, fortified their homes, slept with rifles next to their beds, taught their children to recognize the sound of approaching horses and where to hide when shooting started. They turned their homesteads into fortresses and waited, for justice, for law, for something to change. It took years, took federal courts finally ruling on the land grant disputes, took some of the worst company enforcers getting killed or arrested or simply moving on to easier money. Took Clay Allison leaving the territory after one too many killings made even his presence dangerous. Slowly, gradually, the violence decreased, not because anyone won, but because everyone was exhausted. By the early 1880s, the Colfax County War was effectively over. The Maxwell Land Grant Company kept most of their land. Courts ruled in their favor more often than not. Some settlers received compensation, most didn't. The dead stayed dead. The displaced stayed displaced. And northern New Mexico moved on, carrying the scars but not talking about them much. Here's what makes the Colfax County War different from other range wars. It wasn't cattlemen versus sheep herders, wasn't rustlers versus ranchers. It was a corporation with legal paperwork versus individual families with moral claims. It was industrial capitalism colliding with frontier homesteading, and it showed what happened when those two forces met violently. The body count was never officially tallied. No comprehensive record exists. Estimates range from 20 to over 50 deaths directly related to the conflict. That doesn't count people who died from related causes, starvation after being driven from their land, exposure after fleeing into the mountains, suicides from men who lost everything and saw no way forward. Clay Allison survived the war, but not by much. He left New Mexico and drifted back to Texas. In 1887, he fell off a freight wagon while drunk. The wagon's wheels crushed him. He died not from a bullet, but from a stupid accident. The most dangerous gunfighter in the Colfax County War killed by his own carelessness and whiskey. There's a cruel irony in that. The Maxwell land grant itself eventually broke up. Pieces sold off, subdivided. What couldn't be held by force was lost through economics. The company that fought so hard to keep every acre ended up selling it off piecemeal anyway. The settlers they killed and displaced and terrorized, they were right all along. The land could have been shared, should have been shared. But greed and pride and violence made compromise impossible. But the Colfax County War mattered. It showed the dark side of Western expansion. Not the romantic version with cowboys and cattle drives and wide-open spaces. The violent version, in which businesses employed assassins, the government prioritized wealth over people, and common families were trapped between uncontrollable forces with no way out. It proved that the Old West wasn't always about individual gunfighters facing each other on dusty streets at high noon. Sometimes it was about systemic violence, about power protecting itself, about people with nothing losing to people with everything, and about how easily killing becomes normal when nobody with authority will stop it. The Colfax County War lasted roughly from 1875 to 1881. 6 years of intermittent violence. 6 years of ambushes and murders and fear. 6 years where northern New Mexico territory became a place where settlers were murdered for trying to build homes and nobody was ever held accountable. That's the story they don't tell in Western movies. The one without heroes, without clean resolutions, without justice, just blood soaked into New Mexico soil and widows trying to explain to their children why their father isn't coming home, and cattle barons counting their acres while bodies cooled in shallow graves. The Colfax County War, where the law failed, where violence won, and where the Old West showed its ugliest face.